Sit.
Yeah. Thank you.
Please.
Dr. Kandel, several years ago, a piece was written about you which reported that your love-hate relationship with Vienna was focused on a major street which was named after a famous anti-Semite, and you're urging that that name possibly be changed. Did that occur, or has your attitude changed about that?
No, my attitude has not changed in the slightest. If anything, it's become somewhat stronger. Let me put this into context. The Ringstrasse is Vienna's most magnificent boulevard, and many of its great institutions, the theater, the opera house, the great museum, the Hofburg, and the university sit on the Ringstrasse. Different segments of the Ringstrasse have different names, and the segment of the university, the citadel of learning and integrity and moral courage, sits on is called Luegerplatz. Karl Lueger, was a strong political anti-Semite, and Hitler was in Vienna at the time that Lueger was the mayor, and he learned political anti-Semitism from Lueger. He learned that this was a successful political platform, and he adopted many of his rhetorical styles from him. And I find it unacceptable that the University of Vienna should be on a place that's named after Lueger. There is another part of the city that has a square named after Lueger. I'm perfectly comfortable if they insist on doing that. It's hard for me to say whether there's been real progress. There's been discussion, including discussions in newspapers, because I've spoken as strongly, if not stronger, in Vienna about this. And the universities become interested. Perhaps they would call it University Place. They should call it any other name. The recent mayor of Vienna died, and there's a possibility that it might be named after him. And I think the more discussions of this sort that we have, both here and in Vienna, the more likely this is to occur.
Forgive me, I realize that I've neglected one of my duties. I was asked to say a few introductory words about both of our guests here. I can't imagine what I could say about Dr. Kandel that we haven't had described brilliantly by the movie, but I should say a word, too, about Petra Seeger. Since 1979, she has concentrated on documentaries and film portraits, primarily at that time for the West German Broadcasting Corporation. Then she went on between 1982 and 1987, also working as an assistant director and actor in a variety of feature films in Berlin. And then finally in 1999, she founded the Petra Seeger Film, her own company, and began producing her own films. And if I might, can I ask you just a quick question? Where did the idea of this movie come from?
I met Eric. So, no, really, we met. It was a coincidence. If you ask him, it's another story. We have two stories, like an old... yeah. My memory tells me we met in Berlin by coincidence when in the evening before a friend of mine told me the only man in the moment who brings the field of psychoanalysis in advance is Eric Kandel. And I asked, who is it? And he said, you don't know him. You never know nothing. Yeah, so go reading the book. And the next day, I was invited in a reception in Berlin with the Bundespräsident there. And there was a woman passing in this room with a book called, with Eric Kandel above. And she stopped with a man, and I was waiting for getting the book. And then I saw the man on the book cover is the same man as she talked to. And so I went to him and I said, oh, it's you who brings the field in advance. And he said, yes, of course I am. And then he started to, in this reception, formal reception, talking me about dendrites, about axons, about synapses, and I was so fascinating. And I said, I should do a film about it. And then he called Denise. This is Petra Seeger, a German filmmaker. We are going to make a film together, and it started on the spot. So it's my remembrance.
Is that the way you recall it?
Not quite, but Petra's memory is better than mine, so I must say this at the beginning. I remember being approached by a mutual friend saying, Petra Seeger is interested in doing a film with you, or at least talking to you about a film. And she's terrific. She did a film with my family. And if you are all willing to entertain that, she's the person to do it with. And irrespective of the details, it was a privilege working with Petra, and I'm absolutely delighted and honored that she did this film.
We have a question over here.
Hi, Dr. Kandel. My name is Alex Nguyen. And you said that the reason you went to psychoanalysis was because you wanted to see how someone could be fine one day and kill the next. What did you find was the reason for this, the Nazi behavior, the psychological reason, motivation?
It's very interesting because I've had a chance to sort of return to that theme. Let me just make a detour, as I tend to do. Petra's saying that I laid claim to the fact that I've caused a revolution in psychoanalysis strikes me a little bit off court because I've made no contributions to psychoanalysis. I've pontificated a little bit about how the field ought to redirect itself to scientific lines. But I've come back to this problem of what allows people that otherwise seem to be reasonable human beings to all of a sudden become morally corrupt. And there are several people who have studied this. There is a psychiatrist by the name of Lipton who has studied this in great detail. He's written a book called Nazi Doctors, and a German molecular biologist by the name of Müller-Hill studied it. And Lipton's work was particularly interesting because he interviewed not the survivors, but the people who ran the concentration camps. All concentration camps had physicians, many of them psychiatrists, my profession, and they all had one nose, two eyes, two ears. They loved their wives or whatever. They had children. And so the issue is, what allowed them to behave like this? Now, obviously, there are a number of motivations. Some of them probably were psychopaths. But many of them were socialized. They were taught to act evilly. So learning in some paradoxical way has a role here. So Lipton asked one of these people, I don't understand this. You're a physician. You're trained to save human lives. How can you work in a concentration camp where your job is to destroy people? And this guy turns to Lipton and he said, you don't understand. The Jews were the disease on society. My job was to rid society of the disease. And one of the things Hitler succeeded in doing, that Loeger already began to do, is that this was not a religious difference between Jews and non-Jews. This was a genetic difference. This was a racial difference. And these people are simply inferior. Anybody who could kill Christ is not worthy of being considered a human being, etc., etc., etc. So the definition placed on Jews made them appear to people who were socialized in this way as if, you know, they were not worthy of being taken seriously in terms of the value of their life. And there tragically is a history to this. There was a history within medicine, which American medicine also contributed, in which there was a strong eugenics movement in this country that also caught on in Germany, even before Hitler came to power, in which if people were mentally retarded, they were sterilized. If they were schizophrenic, they were sterilized. And when one realized that first-degree relatives could also pass on the illness, there was an attempt to sterilize them as well. Euthanasia was beginning to be entertained in Europe before Hitler came to power. And Mein Kampf has a whole discussion of this, of the genetic basis for getting rid of the Jews, because they are a burden on society, as are the mentally unfit. So medicine in some ways contributed, but the point I'm trying to make is, I think there are multiple factors, but certainly a free and democratic society that allows alternate views and allows, you know, contrary opinions and would put a restraint on the rise of these aberrant ideas is essential for something like that. And in Germany, this could have happened. And one of the things that happened in Germany was a failure of the intellectuals. In the early days when Hitler came to power, all the historians agree he could have been restrained if, you know, academics had stood up. But the fact is, a lot of academics gained from Hitler coming to power. And they either implicitly or explicitly supported him. So I think it's a societal failure that allows or encourages people to move in this direction.
Thank you.
Reinhold Niebuhr once said that the capability of people for good makes democracy desirable. The capability for evil makes democracy necessary.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Robin, and I'm from NIH. And thanks for making a nice documentary. It's really inspiring for people like us. I'm just beginning my scientific career, and my question is regarding the short-term memory versus the long-term memory. Like you mentioned that short-term memory lies in the dendrites, and then long-term memory occurs as a result of reorganization, right, of the nerve cells. So my question would be like, how much of a time difference is there? Like if I learn something today, it goes to my short-term memory, and how long it takes my brain to get to the long-term memory or the reorganization?
Depending upon the task and the number of repetitions, that varies. But you can see the onset of anatomical changes within a few hours. So the early changes that associate with long-term memory can come on quite rapidly. Usually, at least in aplysia and in many experiments in the mouse, it takes 24 hours for consolidation to really begin to establish itself.
Thank you.
Over here.
My name's Dale Doucette. I'm the executive director of the Science of Information Institute. We have a headquarters here, and our other facility is in Salzburg at the university there. We study information as a science. There's very few people that are into this area, but your explanation of how memory is formed and how it expands brings up a really interesting subject in information, and that is information is ever expanding. And the more you bring it up, the more it expands. The more you use it, the more it expands. And there is a corollary in physics when there's a long discussion of the expanding universe, and I think that there's a corollary between that theory and information and your explanation of how memory is formed. It's ever expanding, and I think there's a corollary here. I think as the universe grows, and it is ever expanding, just like your memory is.
Well, that's a very interesting analogy. I just want to make a point which I may not have made clear in the film, and that is there are learning processes in which there's a growth of synaptic connections. But there are also learning processes like learning how to ignore a stimulus, a process called habituation, in which there are retractions of synaptic connections. So some people get terribly worried, particularly when they see these dramatic changes in aplysia, that their brain is going to explode because they're going to be ever expanding. And there are countervailing processes. Active learning process also, thank God, we forget a lot of things. And as we forget, there's a retraction of synaptic connections. So for example, in aplysia, you can produce a long-term memory that lasts a couple of months. And you can actually follow the retractions of synaptic connections that occur at the tail end of that period. They don't all retract. It never goes quite back to the basal state. That's why it's easier to relearn something once you've learned it. But there is a retraction. So in that sense, hopefully there is a net gain, but there's not an ever-ending expansion.
Over here.
Hi, Dr. Kandel. When I was in college, I studied neuroscience, and we spent a great deal of time, not with mice, but with rats, studying what was called at the time multiple memory systems, spatial memory and stimulus response memory, and the idea that different kinds of memory.
Absolutely.
Well, I've since almost completely lost touch with the research and with the field, and I wonder if you could tell me what has become of the theory of multiple memory systems. Is it important, and where does it rest?
It's absolutely fundamental. Petra and I did not take this up here, but if I can give you another piece of propaganda, Tom Jessel and I had the privilege of giving the Howard Hughes Medical Institute holiday lectures a few weeks ago. And if you Google Howard Hughes Medical Institute Holiday Lectures, HHMI Holiday Lectures 2008. You'll be able to pull up 4 lectures, and the first and fourth lecture I give, and in the first lecture I take up the difference between the major memory systems. Let me just briefly summarize that. Brenda Milner, who got me interested in the hippocampus, was the first one to show in a patient, famous patient HM that just died a few weeks ago, that if you destroy the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe surgically, you lose the ability to convert new short-term information to new long-term information. She felt for the longest time this applied to all areas of knowledge, that you could no longer put things into long-term memory without a hippocampus. And then she discovered there are a whole bunch of things that HM can do, and they all fall into the same class. They're sort of reflex, autonomic, the kinds of things you study in aplysia, HM could continue to do the rest of his life. That's called implicit or non-declarative memory. The other is called explicit or declarative memory. Declarative memory, which HM lost, involves a conscious attempted recall. So when I think of the first time I met Petra, I have to make a conscious effort to recall it. On the other hand, when I rush to the net and try to hit a backhand, I don't think about it getting my shoulder back. I just do this automatically. And in people, you can see dramatic examples of these two different memory stores. And in that lecture, I show a video clip from Clive Waring, a famous British choral conductor that is absolutely spectacular. This guy has a more severe deficit than HM had. Doesn't remember a damn thing. Doesn't remember that he sat down 2 minutes ago in this chair, okay? In terms of a conscious recall of it. But you put him in front of a piano, and he plays the music that he was familiar with as if there was nothing wrong with him. You ask him 2 minutes later, do you enjoy playing the piano? He said, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't played piano since I got ill. So he doesn't remember that a couple of minutes ago he was playing. And that is, you can see in lots of contexts. Once you master something, you often move it from explicit memory to, obviously, to learn how to play a piece. You have to pay attention and you really have to encode it consciously. But once you've done it, you move it into implicit memory storage. And even in mid-stages of Alzheimer's disease, you can still do this. De Kooning, the painter, advanced Alzheimer's disease, painted paintings that got millions of dollars. So the multiple memory systems are alive and well. In fact, there probably are subsystems within that, and there are, beginning to describe that. But it's absolutely a fundamental tenet. It allows me to make another point, and that is that there is a view in certain people's minds that the neurobiology of learning and memory is not only reductionist, but an eliminative reductionist. There's some people who think, well, when these muscular, molecular neurobiologists come along, they're going to wipe out all psychological knowledge. Psychology is folklore, and that's nonsense. Psychology is essentially the discipline that most neurobiologists want to explain. We see this as a new synthesis. When I think of a new science of mind, I mean the coming together, as we emphasized in the movie, of psychology and neuroscience as a unified science. Not that one is going to replace the other.
Does anyone have a question for Petra at this moment? If not, I'd like to ask one. You obviously had to have learned a great deal as you made this movie. Were you ever tempted to change places with the laboratory scientists that you were filming? As they no, you.
No. I'm a filmmaker, and I will remain a filmmaker. So, but I have the privilege to go with empathy in a field somewhere. And this time it was science, but then I go back to my where I come from. So.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Over here.
Hi, Dr. Kandel. Would you be able to provide your perspectives on dreams and how they relate to childhood memory, childhood experiences and memory?
Oh gosh, I really don't know that much about the biology of dreams to give you anything more than sort of a textbook knowledge of it. I can speak a little bit about childhood memory. Okay. I mean, Freud made this interesting point that there is an infantile amnesia, that most people do not remember back beyond, earlier than 4 years of age. It varies a little bit with different people. And that's by and large true. He thought that this was repression, that in fact the memories are there, stored in the brain, but one doesn't access them because, the mind was overwhelmed by this information and things like this, some reason for repression. It turns out that there is infantile amnesia, but it's not repression. The hippocampus, which stores these kinds of memories, is not mature enough to handle it. So it's a little bit like an HN syndrome. Kids certainly remember explicit things. They remember how to walk and how to talk and things like this. That doesn't leave them. But conscious recall of things is not there because they just didn't have the system that would function to allow it to occur.
All right, thank you.
I'm afraid our time is running short, so this will, I think, will have to be our last question over here.
During the movie, you mentioned how memories are stored in bonds between dendrites, but what I was confused about was how the smaller details of the memory are stored, and is there like a pattern in the bond form that can tell you what the memory was?
No, that's a terrific point. I was speaking about a general process that applies for different kinds of memories. I did not go into anatomical distinctions that are associated with different kinds of memory. So when you and I look at one another and we try to store information about, my storing information about your face and you're trying this with my face, that involves recruitment of activity in the visual system. And insofar as we store each other's image, there's a special space area, a set of space areas in the temporal lobe that stores that information. On the other hand, you and I are also talking to each other and remembering the language that we communicate. That's stored in different part of the brain that is concerned with storing speech information, the vocal information. So the mechanisms can be quite similar, but the locus of storage is extremely different. That's why I make the distinction between the systems properties of memory, what memory systems are recruited, what anatomical systems are recruited for different kinds of memory, and the molecular problems. The molecular problems are quite conserved. They're not all identical. There are lots of variations. But the basic ideas are the same. Synapses are the almost universal feature of memory storage, short-term, long-term, that kind of thing is general. But the sites are extremely important and determine the nature of the memory that's stored.
I'm sure we all wish we could stay here all night, but I'm afraid it's not possible. But I would like us all to thank Dr. Kandel and Petra Seeger one more time.